Hi, I'm David Tower and welcome again to the Theories of Everything program. In our first program in this series of Theories of Complexity, we interviewed Dr. Jim Franklin, who is an Associate Professor of Mathematics at the University of New South Wales. He'd recently reviewed a book by Stephen Wolfram, an eminent mathematician, on a new way of modelling reality using cellular automata. Cellular automata is a process that Wolfram believes can model the nature of reality, can model particularly more complex processes like turbulence in fluids and biological processes. It can model them more accurately and more holistically, if you like, than the current methods using differential equations used by physicists and all scientists today. So Jim shed some light on this process of modelling complexity, and one of the aspects of cellular automata which is crucial and vital is that from simple rules that guide the process of cells lighting up or not lighting up, forming different patterns depending on their neighbours, and move over a time period in lockstep, that this process can start from very simple rules depending on the number of neighbours that are lit up or in a particular state, but can generate, on occasion, quite complex patterns that do mirror many of the complex patterns in biology, for example. Complexity itself, or the notion of complexity abstracted away from processes, has only been really researched, discussed, understood, partially anyway, over the last 30 or 40 years. Just in the same way, if you like, that a system, the notion of a system, was only abstracted perhaps 100 years ago. The notion that things that are connected in various ways, various relationships between those parts, can form a system. And the system doesn't have to be a physical system like you or I, or the camera. It can be something that has relationships such as a social system, an education system, a communication system, a transport system. The parts don't physically have to join, but are connected by various relationships, some strong and some weak. And so this notion of complexity also developed, and it became paramount that some sort of concept like this should be abstracted and researched and understood better, because it became glaringly apparent that many of the processes that physicists, biologists, cosmologists were studying just didn't fit into place using the current techniques of the scientific method, the current techniques of science. Because science really was broadly, not completely, but broadly reductionist in its whole approach. The scientific method was fine, the method of discovery, the method of forming a hypothesis, of testing that hypothesis, predicting from it. If it didn't fit, if the experiments didn't work out, if it didn't accurately mirror reality, then it was tossed out or amended and so forth, and this iterative process continued. But really reductionism says, let's look at the smallest and smallest and smallest part of a phenomenon, a substance or a social phenomenon. And let's, by understanding its parts, we'll be able to understand the whole thing. And of course that doesn't work, because by understanding the components of a cell, for example, you can't really understand the cell as a whole, because it's too complex. There are too many parts, there are too many connections. You can't understand life by life itself, the whole adaptive evolutionary process of life, by understanding the chemical components of biology that make up the chemistry of life. It's just not possible. And you can go on and on. Ecological systems, ecosystems, life systems particularly, are not amenable to a reductionist approach. Reductionism takes you so far. Reductionism is based usually on axioms, but it never quite captures the whole picture. And it doesn't show that transition state that takes you from inorganic substances, materials, processes to the organic. But really it's much wider than this. Complexity, and we talk about complex systems because it's much easier to understand, and of course research, and that's much more relevant to understand, to research a particular system, a biological system like you or I, or a cosmological system like the solar system or our galaxy or black holes. It's much better to talk about a system that is simple or a system that is complex. You can also talk about a complex process or a simple process, but generally it's systems that are discussed. So abstracting what really does make up this sort of very, very, very difficult to pin down phenomenon of complexity is very hard to get the mind around. And of course the mind itself, as an outcome of the brain, which itself is an aggregation of brain cells. Understand the cells, but you don't understand the brain, and understanding the brain doesn't give you a fix on things like consciousness and subjectiveness in the brain, which manifests as the mind. So again, getting one's mind around complexity has been a difficult process, because complexity is complex. It may be that complexity can emanate from simplicity, but the process itself and understanding is complex, and a number of eminent institutions have been established to try to pin this down. That is their main research focus, like the Santa Fe Institute is the most famous one, the most well-known one, and has a galaxy of stars, intellectual stars, try to pin this thing down. So there was a driving force. The driving force was knowledge, discovery, to try to understand difficult things like life and consciousness, and living things like Gaia, the whole earth, the complexity of the whole thing. And even simpler things like aggregations of bees or ants. A hive of bees, a hive of ants is different. Its behaviour is different. Its outcomes are different from the individual ant behaviours. You can get some fix on what the ants do, but you can't understand the thing as a whole. Even something more simple like the flocking of birds is difficult to understand by purely looking at individual bird behaviour. It changes. It goes through something. Something changes, and it produces new behaviour, new outcomes. And of course, scientists, to a large extent, for the first half of the last century anyway, were really in denial about these sorts of things, about this sort of thing that they were unable to put a finger on, knew was sort of there, but couldn't really differentiate. What they did, of course, what they were very good at, was discovering new rules, equations, algorithms for very difficult physical processes, understanding quantum theory through Schrodinger's equation, understanding early gravity through and forces and acceleration through Newton's equations, understanding electromagnetism through Maxwell's equations, understanding relativity through a more advanced form of gravity and space-time through Einstein's equations. These equations boil down to fairly simple, extremely compact equations, but they don't quite deliver when it comes to understanding aggregations. Again, aggregations of phenomena. In other words, quantum theory is very good at understanding the forces and particles of subatomic matter. But understanding when you bring those particles together, perhaps at something just above zero temperature, absolute zero, understanding what happens to those particles, or understanding what happens to the particles in a superconductive process, is not easily done, wasn't easily done by the current techniques. So something else had to be injected. That something was a better understanding, a more holistic understanding of the processes around this thing called complexity, or dynamic complex systems. Another reason, of course, for understanding the process, the system of complexity, the phenomena of complexity, was the fact that our whole being our whole universe, our whole life has emerged over time to become more complex. Starting from inorganic processes that started on this earth as a spin-off from the early sun, combining with various molecules, various hydrocarbons, water, etc., and suddenly producing, or not quite suddenly, but after, say, 1 billion years, producing life, single cellular organisms, early bacteria, and then progressing to multicellular organisms, progressing to eukaryotes, which have a nucleus in the cell rather than one that doesn't, and progressing again through very simple forms, aggregations of those multicellular organisms, if you like, and producing finally, around about 500 million years ago, early animals, early plants, etc., in the form of earthworms, and then progressing through the whole stream of life. Many dead ends, many times when life was almost wiped out, quite a number of times, huge impacts from meteorites, etc., changes in climate. But over time there's been a progression of complexity in life. There's also been a progression of complexity in the universe as a whole, starting off with, if you like, after the Big Bang, hydrogen gas, and forming the early stars, forming early solar systems, galaxies, clusters of galaxies, etc., etc. The complexity of life has grown because form and function has developed over that time. Early animals became vertebrates, they developed a backbone, they developed digestion processes, they developed nervous systems, they developed early prototype brains, they developed bigger brains, more complex brains. If you take time slices over the evolutionary period, particularly from 500 million years ago on, there may be lots of dead ends, discontinuities, and there's also heaps and heaps of animals, organisms from that time, such as bacteria, such as cockroaches. But again, always moving along, you'll see animals with bigger brains, more complex forms, able to use lungs on land, for example, developing lungs from the early gill systems in water, developing the opposable thumbs, developing the ability to climb and eventually the ability to walk, larger brains to understand life, and here we are today. An enormously complex process, but taking time slices, complexity in the form of more complex body forms, more robust body forms, more complex nervous systems and brains, not just larger brains, but more complex functions in those brains. Early hominids had a brain about a quarter the size of ours. The neocortex, the surface on the top of the brain's been fairly recent, and it's where a lot of cognitive thinking and abstract thinking is done today. So that trajectory of complexity has continued, and that has to be accounted for. How and why did that occur, and what does it mean? So we can see that there's been vital drivers to understand the process of complexity, to understand complex systems, and to try to get a grip on what really drives life. So viewers, what are the characteristics of complex systems, complex processes? Well, first of all, the processes driving them are non-linear, in that the outputs aren't directly proportional to the inputs. The outputs, because of the types of functions involved, can vary widely. There may be exponential factors in that process. So you can put in a simple value, but it gets raised to a particular power and it bears no simple relationship to the input. And what makes that process more complex is that there are usually feedback loops. In other words, processes just don't attenuate into thin air. They feed back into other things just like sound systems do. They feed back into other parts of the system. They have an effect. So outputs become inputs. And this happens usually with, for example, in biological systems such as the cell, it happens on a huge scale. Inside one simple cell, there are thousands of different processes going on, and they're all non-linear, practically all non-linear, and they're all feeding back into each other, creating different outcomes. Of course, there is method in the madness. The outcomes all produce, and all designed to produce, generally a particular outcome. But the trouble is, using a reductionist approach, trying to understand it in that manner, scientists get information overload. It just becomes too overwhelming, because you may have many components. There's again thousands of components, thousands of different molecules within something like a cell, or within something like an Earth system, an ecological system, that if you try to sort of connect up all the dots, it just becomes overwhelming. And this is what makes complex systems. So we have nonlinear processes, we have feedback loops, we have multiple feedback loops, we have large numbers often of components, all again feeding various ways, and we have thresholds, because always the nonlinear behaviour doesn't manifest perhaps at the start of the process, it only manifests after a certain build-up, over a certain threshold, over a certain value. Does this behaviour change? And that of course brings us to another key aspect of many complex systems, and that is chaos. Chaos itself was also, again, scientists were in denial about the process of chaos for a long time, and connected to that the process of understanding phenomena in the form of fractals. The nice linear processes, always complex processes, were brought back to these approximate linear processes to simplify them, and they still are in many cases. But sometimes that doesn't work very well at all. And they were in denial about the fact that things could become this complex. Always there was an attempt, if you like, to bring it back to one simple equation, and sometimes that was successful, but often not. And so a reductionist approach was the process that was followed. So we have chaos starts from a process that's extremely sensitive to initial conditions, but can rapidly diverge from those conditions, as with the weather, for example, the weather being a good example. Turbulent flows in fluids can be another example. And depending on just slight variations in the initial conditions or the surrounding environment, the noise factors, for example. Remember, all systems have environments. Systems aren't sort of absolute on their own. Systems themselves interleave with other larger systems, like a series of Russian dolls, all interconnected. So life, agriculture, etc., plant growth, animal life, animal systems, biodiversity are all interconnected to the climate. They're all interconnected to the oceans, to the land masses, to the atmosphere. They're all interconnected to food webs. They're all interconnected to solar energy, and so forth. So all of these factors into play, and some of them can become quite chaotic. Usually chaotic systems, though, have attractors. In other words, there are limitations on the level of chaos that can be reached, thank goodness. Normally you don't get a snowstorm in the Sahara, and you don't get temperatures above 200 degrees in Sydney, for example. So basically you've got factors of non-determinism, you've got complex interrelating feedback loops, you've got non-linear processes, you've got often thousands and tens of thousands of different components and with different parameters. And that's why things are complex, and that produces the phenomenon of complexity. So viewers, we've discussed the need to better understand this phenomenon of complexity. We've discussed the characteristics of the phenomenon of complex processes, but we need to be able to model those processes, and science needs to be able to model them to be able to do their normal predictive thing, to get a better understanding of reality and outcomes all around us. Physical outcomes, biological outcomes, cosmological outcomes, psychological outcomes. All these various aspects of our reality involve complex processes. And that's where mathematical artefacts such as and computational artefacts such as cellular automata come back into play. Wolfram's thesis was that modelling via cellular automata, which again is like a giant chessboard with cells, each individual cell's behaviour is related to its neighbours. It can be one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, multi-dimensional. But either way, out of applying simple rules like changing the state of a cell depending on its neighbours, you can get very complex outcomes. And he says this is an improvement. This computational evolving process is an improvement over traditional mathematics using differential equations, partial differential equations and systems of those equations which are used normally to model complex systems. Once past a particular threshold of complexity, even though the rules are still simple, but once past a certain threshold, these patterns become much more interesting and much more alive, much better at modelling the universe we live in. In fact, he says it can be used to model the complete universe. It's interesting, though, when he applies this type of model, that he says it's the information flows that are critical. It's not so much the geometry, it's all about information flows, and that was also what it was about in the increase in complexity over time. It's the aggregation of critical information to those life processes or inorganic processes that are used to as a bulwark against entropy. Entropy relating again to the process whereby energy is dissipated over time. It's conserved, but it's still dissipated it's fragmented, if you like. There's more, it becomes random, hot things become cool, and so forth, and loses structure. But structure, as we know, is part of this universe, part of complexity. So the continuing drive of complexity is managed by the continuous aggregation of information, flows of information, which you can use to better understand through these networks. So information, entropy, complexity, chaos, evolution, all these things interrelate and in the middle sits complexity, right at the heart. So viewers, let there be no mistake about this. Understanding complexity at a deeper level will have an immense impact, and is already having an immense impact on the scientific community and on scientific research, and will have a major benefit and value to humanity as a whole. For example, in the field of climate prediction, already a better understanding, a better, more accurate way of predicting the onset of the El Nino cycle and its completion is having an impact on farm management, and in the future will have a major impact on food production. As will a better understanding of animal dynamics, population dynamics. For example, the fish, it'll be able to allow scientists to manage fish stocks better, so that they're not overfished and depleted, but remain a valuable resource for everyone on Earth. And then there's brain chemistry. There's really difficult, subtle interplays between neurotransmitters and neurons, and especially at the deeper behavioural level, and the ability to understand addiction, for example. This will have a major impact on health for the community as a whole. And then there's space. Understanding the complex relationships between the Sun's magnetic field and the Earth's magnetic field should reduce the risk in the future of damage to instrumentation, for example on satellites or the space station. And particularly the economy. There's now a deeper, more subtle understanding of the interplay between government policy and market forces and market agents, so that in the future economies will be much better managed and have ripple-on impacts, beneficial impacts for the globe as a whole. So we can see, viewers, that there is an immense treasure trove here, just through this deeper understanding of complexity. And it's a treasure trove that we'll look forward to delving into in the third and final program in our series next week. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program again. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.